All right, good afternoon. Thank you for sticking around, both those of you here and in the virtual audience. My name is Kyle Spragens. I am the statewide waterfowl coordinator for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I serve as the agency's representative to the Pacific Flyway Study Committee, charged with crafting flyway management plans, annually assessing population status, trends, and harvest results to inform future management decisions and actions. I want to thank my co-authors, Daniel Zimmerman, who was here but had to get back to Washington, and Callie Moore, both with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Martha Jordan of the Northwest Swan Conservation Association, who's critical to the on-the-ground, difficult but necessary face-to-face interactions we encounter in Washington State. My talk today will hone in on the conservation challenges for our two native species of swans in Washington State. And I put emphasis around challenges because there's more behind the use of this word than might first appear. 2 weeks ago, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, NAPSI, released the most recent State of the Birds report. This report, which in previous iterations sounded the alarm that has developed into the 3 Billion Birds Initiative, but at the time, they lumped all waterfowl species, ducks, geese, and swans into one bird group. While taxonomically that is not wrong, from a functional habitat use and a conservation perspective, it was disappointing to a waterfowl nerd such as myself because the original report innocently stated waterfowl have seen a 56% increase in population since 1970 and represent one of the America's best wildlife success stories, which was interpreted as, good job, everybody. We can move on. Nice work. The revamp thankfully broke apart the waterfowl family into 3 functional groups that certainly better brackets the challenges we face in waterfowl management. With the geese and swans off the charts, dabbling and diving ducks showing their expected cyclic population patterns driven by wetland conditions on the breeding grounds, and the depressing continued decline of our marine-dependent seafarers, the sea ducks. The statement for the exceptional growth in geese and swans was stated as being largely due to successful adaptation to agricultural and urban landscapes. The 2019 report stated this group, the waterfowl, serves as a model for how habitat protection and restoration can reverse bird decline. Its recovery owes thanks to federal investments such as the Migratory Bird Stamp, federal duck stamp, and the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, which powered waterfowl conservation efforts. In other words, habitat is critical and it requires and maintaining long-term funding and policy investments from partners and supporters that share a common goal of habitat conservation for the benefit of migratory birds is what works. With that thought in mind, this federal duck stamp from 1951 is fitting, as this is the year that the flyway management system was formalized here in North America. While coordinated management for harvest regulations or population management is what most people think of about this flyway management term, the challenge was thinking and influencing a diverse array of habitat requirements across the annual life cycle of migratory birds at flyway scales. The game changer to facilitate this ambitious scale was outlined in the original North American Waterfowl Management Plan in 1986 and was manifested in the form of the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan, starting in 1986, gave rise to what has developed into 22 habitat joint ventures and 3 species joint ventures. For Washington State, we intersect and participate with 4 of the JV partnerships. Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture to the west of the Cascade Mountain Range, which includes all of Alaska, the Intermountain West Joint Venture to the east of the Cascades, where we sit today and is the largest JV by area, the Sea Duck Joint Venture, and the Arctic Goose Joint Venture. So at this point, several of you may be thinking, get to the swans already. But my point is this: you will notice that swans were not isolated as their own species joint venture. And why? Well, I'd speculate because they were absorbed into the habitat joint ventures, as there was already a strong foundation of monitoring for this group, and it was improving at the time. And the most relevant lever or management action in flyway management was already turned off. Harvest was closed, leaving habitat conservation, enhancement, and management as the only real options to conserve swans and their habitats. In other words, as is shown by the Intermountain West joint venture logo, swans were a narrative species, or to steal Dave's term, an ambassador for facilitating the need for habitat with conservation partners across the continent through using them to highlight the importance of certain critical wetland types. So now to the swans. Washington State, as part of the Pacific Flyway, has benefited tremendously from the extensive monitoring efforts and waterfowl research led by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Migratory Birds and Refuges in Alaska, and the USGS Alaska Science Center, Dr. Craig Ely, and this is particularly true for swans. From a management perspective, the two swan species are guided by 4 Pacific Flyway management plans. The 2 most important plans in Washington State are tied to the Western Tundra swan, denoted here in all the blue, as well as the oddball group of tundras indicated in the red down at Eisenbeck National Wildlife Refuge, and the Pacific Coast population of trumpeter swan indicated by all of the yellow values. From a Washington State perspective, the Alaska Peninsula, the trunk of the elephant, if you envision an elephant head, the tundra swans pass through Washington on a regular basis, or at most about 13,000 of the 101,000 Western tundra swans. And theoretically, all of the trumpeter swans in the interior forest wetland region of Alaska. During January 2022, an expanded survey effort, both ground-based and aerial-based, documented a record high of 22,870 total swans. This is very likely a minimum in Western Washington, notably in every Western county of the state, as indicated on this map. Consistently, 80% of the wintering swans are now trumpeter swans, not the case in the late 80s. And the overwhelming winter concentration is focused on Skagit County and the surrounding areas known as the northern Puget Lowlands, right at the BC-Washington border. There is also a notable concentration down here in the lower Columbia River, which is picked up off of surveys conducted by Brandon and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Surveys. I'm only portraying the Washington side of that, but there are far more birds down in that zone. This is a tremendous effort, and certainly folks in this room, such as Brandon, Martha, and Shelley, contributed greatly to our knowledge of what might be out there. So good job, everybody. We can move on now. Nice work. But that is not the end of the story. I probably do not need to remind folks in this room that waterfowl need wetlands. Unfortunately, that is not always true when speaking to members of the public or even other agencies or supervisors or politicians or governments, and reminding them that different waterfowl have different requirements, and those requirements are found in different habitats, is an important nuance, because certain waterfowl are now dependent upon drastically altered landscape. For example, those 13,000 plus swans in Skagit County, which is only a sliver of its former natural habitat mosaic, that the increasing swan and goose populations have benefited greatly from. But instead of seeing scenes like this, which probably dominated the Western Washington landscape, the swans have become dependent upon scenes like this. So in terms of challenges, there are certainly the direct challenges that we've heard, that you have gotten to hear from several presenters and posters from Washington. Daniel and Alicia highlighted the legacy lead issues and power line strikes. The poster from Shelley Ament out in Clallam County also highlighted the power line strike issues. Martha highlighted the fact of the legacy lead and the expanding and different sources of lead that may have not been obvious at first glance in the sort of early stages of the response. But there are more challenges facing them. This list, I'm just trying to grasp a few of them. The fact that Western Washington has experienced extensive wetland loss in both the estuarine and the freshwater side of the system, more than 85% on both sides, pinching that wetland availability towards each other in a ever narrowing landscape in Western Washington. Swan diets are almost completely supplemented by waterfowl-friendly crops and farming practices, supplementing that swan diet and largely found on exclusively private lands. Farmers are not feeding waterfowl for free. Both swan populations are now above the stated flyway plan objectives for Western tundra swans since the 1980s, and for the Pacific Coast population of trumpeter swans since 2006. As swans are closed to harvest in Washington, and the Pacific Coast population of trumpeter swans closed to harvest since the inception of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, crop damage has become more pronounced and harder to deal with, especially as swans are not in isolation in the zone, particularly in the Skagit. There is high competition with other waterfowl species, such as the Wrangell Islands population of snow geese, and an immense number of dabbling ducks that are also dependent on this supplemental food resource. The Pacific Coast population of trumpeter swan is particularly present in this conundrum. While population of objective of 25,000 was surpassed in 2006, what does this objective mean? And with diminishing survey efforts, as we heard from Mark Vertiska with the North American Trumpeter Swan Survey, and current questions about the frequency of the traditional survey due to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service budgets, how do we maintain monitoring going forward? Washington, Oregon, and California do not have legal regulated harvest seasons for any of the swans for different reasons. In Washington, one of those reasons is the landscape is dominated by trumpeter swans. As I mentioned, more than 80% trumpeter swans in Western Washington. But the historic Migratory Bird Treaty era harvest closure did not just impact recreational harvest. Trumpeter swans continue to not be allowed for subsistence harvest. And because no federal framework exists, then no tribal season may be selected. It is very difficult to look in the eyes of our Migratory Bird Co-Management Council members and try to provide an explanation as to why, when prices of store foods are astronomical, why one of the first spring food sources of protein has continued to not be available for more than 100 years. So what is the motivation to protect and conserve those forest wetland habitats from other detrimental impacts from their perspective? Finally, swans are not in isolation. As I mentioned, the high competition with the Wrangell Island population of snow geese and the dabbling ducks for that same supplemental food resource causes difficult decisions in targeting waterfowl habitat and the efforts on public lands. In some cases, you are forced to choose. The equivalent in the last 10 years between those main waterfowl types found in the Skagit has resulted in an increase of approximately 20 million duck energy day equivalents. That's a lot more food demand on that landscape, and it is not coming from the public land. So, to keep scenes like this, using swans and other waterfowl species to tell those stories is an essential tool towards ensuring habitat remains on the ground throughout their annual journey. To build the necessary partnerships that span the breadth of waterfowl conservation and management, and to maintain the support for wetlands and waterfowl habitats into the future. So, against the background of a Washington Youth's federal junior duck stamp submission entry that did not win, I would amend my simplistic statement to include a vital piece of the puzzle. All of us. So, thank you.